So, here we are once again, at the end of a spooky season. So I believe that you expect a story from me. And as usual, I'm here to deliver. Keeping in our theme, let's talk about guilt, but in a different sort of way. Not guilt for something you've done, but guilt for something that never happened to you. Ice cold. Day 1. The wind moaned sadly across the tundra. Mardon stood still, watching the silent white field. Even through his heavy armor, the cold bit at him. One foot shifted against the ice under his boot. The resulting crunch was satisfying, but did little to lift Mardon's mood. Nothing. There was always nothing. Just the ice, the cold, and the mournful wind. Not even snow dared break the calm of the tundra. That, at least, would have broken up the monotony. His last station had more to look at on watch. Mardon shrugged off the thought, not wanting to go down into the rabbit hole his memory would take him. He stretched his shoulders, a barely perceptible movement beyond his military demeanor. "Yo, Sarge!" The tinny voice broke through his concentration. "Time's up. Come in and get some soap." "Yep," Mardon replied. The beeps were almost satisfying as Mardon disconnected the computer in his suit. The O2 vented into the armory around him as he lifted the helmet from his head. He sighed deeply as the weight left him. "See anything?" the voice asked, this time not as tinny as she stood in the doorway. Mardon looked toward Grace. She leaned nonchalantly against the doorframe, smiling at him. He gave a deep scoff, then gestured at her hands. More importantly, the mug of coffee that she held. "That for me?" His voice rasped as though he had swallowed gravel. Her smile widened. She offered the mug to him. He took it gratefully, drinking a big swallow and savoring the burn as it clung to his throat on the way down. Hot, but satisfying. "Well, you haven't missed anything," Grace said, stepping into the armory next to him. She began to undress as he continued to strip off the heavy armor. It was almost a ritual by this time. Shelley and Chris sat in barely concealed romance. Mardon had to give a short laugh at that. Kevin was bored, and the Cap just read the bulletins and drank his coffee. Grace lifted her armor over the tank top she wore, and shifted uneasily as she tried to adjust the weight. "Radio?" Mardon asked as he pulled his BDU pants on. "Well," she cursed under her breath as something somewhere pinched her. "I swear, if we don't get new armor soon, these suits are going to fall apart." Mardon smirked. With a sigh, she lifted the helmet above her head and pulled it over her short brown hair. "At least they still work for now." The tinny quality was back. Mardon put his hat on and looked at her, his usual half-smile present. "Thanks for not talking my ear off, like usual," she said. The playful sarcasm wasn't lost in the transmission. "See you later, babe." He practically heard the wink behind the reflective shield of his helmet. "Don't freeze. You still owe me a good cup of coffee," he said. "Dick." She turned with a laugh and left through the blast doors, leaving Mardon alone again. Grace was professional, when she needed to be. That was probably what Mardon liked best about her. She understood the need for both seriousness and levity. He tossed back the rest of the coffee and left the armory. Kevin, though arguably Mardon's best friend, was his polar opposite. While Mardon was a man of few words, Kevin could talk a wall to death. Just as expected, when Mardon entered the mess, Kevin was chattering away to himself. How that man ever made it as a sniper was beyond Mardon. He grabbed a bowl and pushed it under the machine. A button push later, and the whirring produced a thin white soup with pink chunks in it. "Ham soup!" Kevin called across the mess. Mardon grimaced. With a sigh, he walked away with food in hand. "Sir, nothing to report," Mardon said as he passed the captain, who nodded, barely glancing up from his holotab. Mardon dropped into the seat across from Kevin. From this angle, he could see the whole mess. The only soldiers not present were Grace, Will on radio, and Megan, who Mardon had relieved from watch. She was probably sleeping by now. There was Chris and Shelley, busy not being in love. The captain and Kevin, who was already talking to Mardon, spooning his soup. "Beats the swamp, though," Kevin finished. Mardon gave a short chuckle. "Dunno. I like lizard." Kevin guffawed. This was the third time they had had this conversation, but at least Kevin was good for a laugh. They talked. Well, Kevin talked, and Mardon gave his succinct answers. In the meantime, he let his mind wander. The tundra was punishment. He supposed that was the best way to look at it. Everyone here had been given the option of discharge or finish their tour here. Some of the soldiers had changed, but with such a small crew, everyone knew each other. Though not everyone was open about why they were here. Mardon knew why he was here, and that was all that mattered to him. Chris and Shelley had arrived at the same time for the same obvious reason. Kevin was here for the same reason as Mardon. Sort of. The captain never told them why he was there, but the stories had gotten around. It wasn't hard to imagine when you had an awful name like he did. Literally, his name was Fort Awful. Everyone just called him Cap or Captain because his name was a sore point. The only story Mardon was even remotely interested in was Grace's. She promised to tell him when they were back home, and he bought her a beer. 2 more years? Something like that. His mind drifted a little too far. There was no point in focusing on that. The future would come as it would. He sighed. The bowl was empty. He was full. Another cup of institutional coffee sat cooling next to his hand. Kevin finished talking when his bowl was empty. Almost in sync, Mardon and Kevin sighed. I knew you were going to do that. Kevin gave a short laugh. Mardon chuckled silently. Psychic, are ya? Mardon asked. Even his deep voice was a stark contrast to Kevin's. Oh yeah, totally. Ugh. Kevin was suddenly solemn, looking at his empty bowl in front of him. I'm tired of this place. Ain't tough, bud. Mardon reached out a hand to Kevin's shoulder. You're short. You'll be gone sooner than me. Kevin gave a laugh. I swear that's the most words you've ever strung together at once. Kevin rose to his feet and took his bowl. Anyway, see you later. Watch? Mardon asked. Nah, just tired. I have inventory. Mardon nodded as Kevin turned and left. He caught the captain eyeing him. There was no doubt in Mardon's mind as to what that was about, but he let it go. Instead, he opted for sleep as well. The long hall to the bunk room was chilly. Mardon walked slowly but deliberately. He was used to the chill in the air by now. The dull, distant hum of the heating machine hinted that there was something combating it, but barely managing. Though, Mardon thought, if it's this cold with it running, he'd hate to see how cold it would be without. He sighed. Again. His drudging pace quickened, hoping to close the distance between him and his bed. The hum notwithstanding, the world was quiet around him. Mardon liked it this way. The swamp was too full of noise, even after years of serving there. It had been too easy to miss the sound of approaching enemies. Here was different. Not only were there no enemies, but it was silent. Silent enough that Mardon's ears picked up the sound of running feet long before Will could barrel around the corner into him. Mardon stepped aside, allowing Will to careen into view. He skidded to a stop when he saw Mardon. Sarge! He gasped at the air, trying to catch the breath that had escaped him in his run. Breathe, Corporal, Mardon said calmly. After a moment passed and Will had calmed slightly, he straightened up, a look of worry splayed on his face. Sarge, we got a message. This wasn't unusual, but there was more to it. Mardon could practically read the message in Will's eyes. Go on. Mardon remained as passive as the world around him, silent, but deep. It said... This wasn't going to work. Mardon put a hand on Will's shoulder, looking him straight in the eye. Get Cap. Meet me at radio. Will nodded and tore off down the hall again. Mardon's eyes lingered longingly on the path that he had been taking. So much for sleep. He waited a moment longer before turning and walking toward the radio room. The paper was heavy. Such a small paper, so light, but held more weight than he was ready for. Mardon stared at it, as if checking it again would change it, as if he could reform the word with his mind. Beyond the codes, after the standard jargon, the message only contained one word. Mardon shifted his gaze to the code sheet. Maybe it wasn't valid, maybe... But no, the codes were accurate. He scanned the lines for just one variation, just one thing that might invalidate this message. Nothing. He sighed, letting his gaze fall to the message once again. What's going on here? The captain's voice broke through Mardon's concentration. He looked up. Awful stood in the doorway, looking thoroughly displeased to see Mardon here. Without a word, he passed the message to Awful, who took it, and Mardon watched as the annoyance drained from his face. The reaction was exactly as Mardon expected. He looked the paper up and down, shifted his eyes from the paper to Will to Mardon, then back. "You checked the codes. Is this valid?" Awful asked, then stepped past Mardon to do it himself. "Yes, sir. It matches up." "It's valid, sir," Mardon said. Awful checked anyway. Begrudgingly, he acknowledged it. He studied the paper, as though trying to do what Mardon had tried. "It won't help." Awful looked up confused. "What does this even mean? It's just one word, no context, nothing." Awful's voice rose with every word, pitching up until he practically screamed. "Nothing," Mardon replied calmly. Then he shifted his attention to Will. "Send a request for verification." "I am the CO here." Awful stepped in. Mardon sighed but nodded and gestured at Will. Will shifted uncomfortably on his feet as he looked toward the captain. Awful didn't say anything, just waved dismissively as he looked back at the page. Opting for the safer route, Mardon decided to give Awful the decision. He was the CO, after all. "What do we tell the men, sir?" Mardon asked. He could see the thoughts going through Awful's mind. It was obvious. Communication was slow here. Even with all of their advanced machines and such, it took about a week to receive any new orders from command. A week for their message to get there, and then a week back. That was too long. They could wait until the reply came back. But there was an answer they would receive sooner. Resupply was due in a couple of days. What if the healer never arrived? How long would their current stores last? Finally, Awful looked up. "Nothing." "Sir, nothing. We say nothing. When the supplies arrive, we will discuss it then. Until then, nothing to worry about." Mardon shifted his eyes to Will slightly, then shifted them back to Awful. He didn't seem to notice. Awful gave a deep, exaggerated sigh and handed the note back to Mardon. "I'm going to bed." Then he stormed out of the office. Mardon waited a moment until he couldn't hear Awful's footsteps anymore. "At least be discreet about it," Mardon said, handing the message to Will while giving him the knowing look of someone who actually paid attention to his troops. Will was sweating profusely. He was no good at keeping secrets. Never had been. That was probably what he had been sent here for in the first place, but that hardly mattered. Considering the size of their little contingent, there was no need for secrecy. Mardon let his gaze fall back to the sheet of paper. The one taunting word seemed to glare back, even through the rear of the paper. It may mean nothing, or it may mean everything. The word seared itself into his mind as he stared. Invasion. Day 2. Mardon blinked, trying to see in the gloomy room. The rack he slept on was only one step up from the floor. Barely. It had been 2 hours since he was finally able to lay down, and he had not slept at all. This was going to be a rough day. He rolled over and put his feet on the floor. The chill shot through his bare feet. With a grunt, he lifted himself. The room was already empty, or had been empty to begin with. Mardon couldn't remember anyone coming in throughout the night, and didn't check if anyone was there to begin with. It was a large berthing, after all. This base had been built for a larger contingent, but was never filled to capacity. Mardon dressed quickly and left. The mess was as full as yesterday, but with a different assortment of people. Grace sat with Kevin and Megan. Chris sat alone now. Captain Awful was gone, but Will sat in his place. He looked pitiful, head down on the table, the bowl of white food sitting untouched nearby. Mardon walked by him on his way to the machine, and patted him on the back, offering him a half smile. Will looked up, a pained expression on his face. Mardon grabbed a bowl and filled it, before joining Grace and the others. He gestured at the soupy white stuff. "Grits?" he suggested. The others were staring at him intently. He sighed. "Are we being invaded?" Kevin asked bluntly. Mardon looked around the mess once more. Awful was probably on the radio now. He returned his eyes to the others and shook his head and shrugged. "Dunno." There was a collective sigh from the others. Chris stood up and crossed the mess to sit with them. Eventually, Will joined them. This would look bad if Awful walked in now. With a rough noise, Mardon cleared his throat. "Look, we got one word. Only one. It doesn't mean anything right now." "That's bullshit," Kevin said simply. Grace put her hand on his arm, but he didn't need it. "No." Mardon shook his head. Even a word as strong as invasion means nothing without context. He put his spoon into the bowl and lifted some to take a bite, then reconsidered. We don't know what they mean. Are we being invaded? Them? Are we doing the invading? We literally know nothing. He paused. A deep breath, and a long moment later he spoke quietly but with enough meaning to catch their attention. We will have our answer tomorrow. The words hung between them, weighty, especially considering who had imparted them. Finally, Mardon took a spoonful of the food and put it in his mouth. He grimaced at the taste. The small radio room was the only warm room in the entire base, due, in part, to the amount of electronic equipment crammed into it. Mardon stepped in and embraced the warmth. Awful was staring at the screen, a sullen expression saying all Mardon would need to know. He pulled up a chair and sat next to him. Nothing new, Awful said through gritted teeth. Mardon nodded in response. There was a pregnant silence as he tried to decide how best to tell Awful. Well, Mardon began. Everyone knows, Awful finished. Mardon tried not to be surprised, but it showed on his face. I'm not as dumb as people may think I am. The way he said people translated easily in Mardon's mind. Never thought you were, Mardon lied. Awful turned to look at him. There was a minor hint of anger behind his eyes, but the predominant emotion was one that Mardon knew far too well. Times like this, facing the unknown, fear was expected, especially in someone who had never served in a combat role. Awful relaxed at his passive look. The men respect you, more than they respect me. Awful turned back to the screen. The blinking icon taunted him. Sir? Mardon asked. Awful replied with a grunt. This your first command? Another silence, longer than the last. Finally, he nodded. Mardon nodded with him. He cleared his throat. The men respect me because I have experience both in leadership and in combat. You are an unknown. The only thing we know about you... He trailed off, gauging Awful's reaction. He was laughing silently. It's true, you know. Awful turned back. The story. Everything is true. He shook his head in disgust, though Mardon wasn't sure who he was disgusted with. It wasn't my mom's fault. Well, I guess it was. She was trying to stick up for me. When she called the commander that day, she just wanted them to stop making fun of me. He chuckled again. Mardon sat patiently waiting for him to finish the story. Stop making fun of my boy's name, she said. I didn't know what to expect when the commander made that announcement. His turn to trail off. I'm not proud of what I did, but thinking about all those men laughing at me at the mess and the commander's voice just echoing in my mind, I barely even remember getting up and walking to his office, but boy, I remember the sound of my fist pounding into his face. Sometimes I sure it was my mom. Others I saw my childhood bullies. Behind every story, there was a human who had lived it. Mardon knew that as stories spread, they grew. Given he had heard everything from Awful killed his CO to Awful turned a rifle on everyone in the mess, he wasn't sure what to believe. It was always good to hear from the horse's mouth. For a moment, he wondered how big his own story had grown. When I finally came to my senses, I was pinned to the ground. The MP made sure I wouldn't be able to hit anyone anymore. My hand was broken. Didn't even feel it till the next day. Next came the trial, and technically the commander was at fault, but I had ruined my career, and they sent me here to forget about me. Awful finished the story with a sniff. Mardon let the silence descend. There was nothing to say. It took an adult to accept the responsibility, and Mardon could tell Awful saw himself as guilty. How long had he served here? Awful had been here when Mardon first arrived, but that hadn't been long ago. Less than a year. He was a captain now, so he had been in for a while. Not as long as Mardon had been, but still a respectable amount of time. There was one area of the base that couldn't be entered without a suit. The hangar. The suit wasn't like the armor for Watch. In some ways it was better, in other ways it was worse. For one, it was much, much lighter. Mardon moved around in the hangar with ease, but what it made up in freedom it lacked in defense. It was much colder. The giant doors needed de-icing before the resupply, and parts of the room had to be cleared. This was a good job for Mardon, at least in that moment. Very little needed as far as brain power. It freed his mind to think about the message. No matter how he thought about it, there was still no clarification. He shifted some boxes out of the way, into the back of the room. The worst part was that he could see the effect it was having on the crew. A light crust of frost had frozen one box to the floor. Mardon gave it a quick kick, reveling slightly in the small victory. Will was demoralized because it was his job when the message came in. Of course, you could tell him all day that it could have been anyone. It wouldn't help. Kevin was already annoyed, and this new development, especially the uncertainty, just made it worse. Everyone else was nervous, bordering on scared, and Awful was cracking. Already cracking. With the box problem solved, Mardon stepped onto the platform. With a press of a button, the console flickered to life. The readouts were fine. He prompted the computer to start the heating elements. Barring any sudden storms during the night, everything should be thawed by... His thoughts trailed off as he stared at the security monitor. The blue of the ice was tinted green with the low light filter. As usual, the screen just showed the ice. Mardon cycled to the next camera. Frozen. The next. Then the next. 3 of the cameras were out of commission. Probably frozen solid. The other 4 showed nothing out of the ordinary. He could have sworn there was something. He shook his head, clearing his thoughts. A loud clunk signaled the end of the first cycle. Despite being sure that he had seen nothing, Mardon was suddenly on edge. His job complete, he left the hangar. There was no destination in his mind. He just wanted to think. And worry. Day 3. The crew shifted uncomfortably in the hangar, watching the door. The cold was seeping in, but the massive heater on the door was fighting it back. They could feel the warmth. This was probably the most comfortable day of the month. The cold wasn't the source of their unease. The anticipation was palpable. Mardon stood stoically ahead of everyone watching the door. Though unreadable, he felt every bit of the pressure that the others did, if not more. No new message had come, not even the manifest that they usually got the day before shipments. This had gone largely unnoticed, or at least unmentioned. They needed to see the supplies come in, or not see them. "All right, soldiers, brace for it," Kevin called from the control console. There was a dull thunk, followed by the rumble as the bay doors began to open. The blast of cold air took them hard as it forced its way into the room. Even Mardon had to gasp a little. "Start the countdown," he called above the noise. Kevin pushed another button. "T-minus 30 minutes," the familiar, emotionless woman said, barely audible. It took a long, arduous wait before the doors finished opening. The silence cascaded around them, deafening in its entirety. The only sound that replaced it was the mournful howl of wind across the tundra. The troops stood still, probably the first time a resupply was ever this serious. They strained to listen for the rotors. Mardon kept his eyes on the bright white beyond the hangar, occasionally shifting his eyes back inside, looking at the walls. "T-minus 25 minutes. Megan gave a slight scream, then a nervous laugh. "At ease, soldier," Awful directed. Mardon resisted the urge to look around at them. "T-minus 5 minutes, the voice taunted. Mardon tightened his jaw. Ice was forming on the outer edge of the door. The crystals glinted in the bright light. Mardon was getting nervous. He didn't let it show, not that they could have seen it through his suit, but he held his emotions at bay. Now would be a bad time to start falling apart. Still, nothing. No movement. No sound besides the damned wind. Usually they would hear it by now, right? No, Mardon reminded himself. They've run late before. He took a deep breath as he steadied himself. "Sir," he called across the bay. Awful visibly jumped, then turned his attention to Mardon. "About that time." There was a moment of silence. The man's face was hidden behind the helmet, but there was no doubt in Mardon's mind that he was fighting off the panic that they were all feeling. Finally he nodded. With a wave, he gave Kevin the command. Kevin stared quietly for a moment before pushing the button again. The rumble returned as the doors began their painstakingly slow return. The closer the doors got to one another, the more the tension built. Finally, as two giants meeting in a storm, the doors sealed with a deep, soul-crushing thud. "Time," the voice called once more. Kevin slammed his hand down on the console, canceling the countdown. Mardon looked back at Awful. The captain was gone. With a shift in his jaw, he turned to the troops and said, "All right, Log it. Supplies are late. Sarge. Grace's voice stung his heart. We follow protocol. Until we know more, the supplies are late, Mardon replied calmly. He took another deep breath. Megan, get to radio, relieve Shelley, let her know what's going on, then send the message. We go into ration protocol. The assembled soldiers nodded and filed out of the room. Grace and Kevin waited with Mardon. The feeling that hovered over them was bleak. For some, this was their only hope against whatever darkness their brains had cooked up. What does it mean? Grace asked. Mardon wanted desperately to give her an answer. There was nothing to say. I'll tell you what it means. It means we're fucked, Kevin interjected, the last word striking hard. Stow it, Sergeant, Mardon ordered. Kevin opened his mouth, but shut it quickly. Even he couldn't find the words to argue. He turned and slammed a fist into the pillar behind them, then stormed out. Mardon watched calmly as he left. He needed that outlet. Then Mardon turned his attention to Grace. Nothing. This has happened before. Remember, they missed 2 months last year. Pretty inconvenient timing, though, isn't it? Grace responded. There was no hostility in her voice, but there was still tension. She probably didn't have the energy to really be upset. Mardon nodded. What are you going to do? This question was more powerful than she could have realized. Mardon lifted his head, focusing on one point, where Awful had been standing. I'm going to see the captain. The door slammed open, causing Awful to jump. Mardon stepped into the room and shut the door behind him. Quick to cover his surprise, Awful lifted a glass toward Mardon. Drink, he offered. Mardon stood solidly blocking the doorway. The look on his face showed the deep emotion he felt in that moment. Awful wilted, sagging into his chair and letting the glass fall to the floor. He exhaled, a torrent of air escaping his lungs. Mardon watched his features. After a moment, he softened. Now is not the time to fall apart, Captain, Mardon said slowly. He was already tired of the sound of his own voice. This was a very talkative week for him, and it had just started. There's nothing, Awful said, his voice barely an audible whisper. Mardon's jaw twitched. There are 6 other soldiers behind that door, sir. Awful's response was a light scoff. Why are you here? Mardon asked. What do you mean? Mardon cut him off. Why are you in the military? Why did you become an officer? He clarified. Awful stared dumbly for a moment. Mardon couldn't be sure if he was thinking up the answer or trying to remember. After that moment, Mardon crossed a small room and sat at the captain's desk. I wanted... Awful closed his eyes, leaning back. You never made it to the field. Mardon's voice was low, but the words crossed the area between them easily. It wasn't a question. Awful shook his head. You never got a taste for combat. You never felt the responsibility of leadership. Awful's head fell forward into his hands. I ask you again, why are you here? Suddenly, Awful stood. He turned to face the wall with his back to Mardon. He stared intently ahead. You're right, he said, a slight quaver in his voice. I shouldn't be here. My mother pushed me into the service. Mardon sighed and averted his eyes. This man was no officer. He had the mentality of a civilian, selfish, scared. Mardon bit back the venom. Whether you're supposed to be here or not is irrelevant. You could have left before coming here. Now, you are here, and these men's lives depend on you. Another sigh. Look, all due respect, sir. Out here, you don't matter. The priorities are the mission, your men, and the service. The venom had gone to Awful now. If that's the case, then you have no room to talk. The way I understand it, you violated priority 1. The taunt stung. Mardon could see himself smashing in Awful's head for that. But it was just a vivid dream. Instead, Mardon rose to his feet, then, with a determined movement, placed a foot on Awful's desk and shoved it aside. The captain turned to see the massive figure reach out and grab him. It took no effort at all for Mardon to lift Awful off the ground and slam him back into the wall. The passive look was somehow more terrifying than if Mardon had been sneering. I am here because I have different priorities, he said deliberately. Now. The pregnant silence fell once more as Mardon brought his face to within an inch of Awful's. Are you going to be the officer these men need? With those final words, Mardon released him, allowing him to fall to the floor with a loud thud. There was only room for one last look before Mardon left Awful. He looked terrified. Good. Maybe he would finally be ready to understand. He left the officer on the ground and retreated. He needed a moment to himself to lick his own wounds. They huddled in the dark, the loud banging thrumming into their bodies. Fear gripped every heart. Mardon glared at the door, the only man standing, facing the oncoming enemy. He raised his rifle to his shoulder. Hopefully, he would be able to buy them enough time to escape. The thudding came harder, causing the very deck under his feet to shake under their thunderous blows. The dim light showed the warping of metal under the stress of the repeated attack. With a deep breath, Mardon readied his house. Death would be welcome this day. A bang, the sound of twisting metal, a giant talon forced through the steel doors. He braced, the fear in him threatening to cause his knees to buckle. "Sarge!" Mardon groaned at the intrusion, the dream fading out. His eyes opened slowly. The dim light was replaced by a red glow of the bunk room. "Sarge, something happened." Day 4. Mardon stared. He wasn't sure which emotion was stronger, his anger or his disgust. Grace looked on in horror, and Kevin just cursed. The whole crew, except Exterior Watch, stood in a small room. Their chain of command had failed them in the worst way as they stared at the corpse in the chair. Awful had taken the easy way out. Mardon knew he needed to say something. Kevin beat him to it. He stepped up to the desk and reached across. "Kevin," Grace started. Then she saw what he was doing. Kevin turned back to Mardon, offering his hand. "Guess this belongs to you now." Mardon looked down at the hand. The silver bars glinted in the light. Blood still clung to the rank insignia. He took it and wiped the blood off. Fucking coward. Kevin's less than graceful send-off wasn't hidden. "All right." Mardon stepped to the desk. "Everyone back to work." Grace stepped in next to him. They stood together for a long time. Mardon stared at the desk while Grace stared at him. He leaned over, resting his fists against the cold metal. Finally, Grace slid her hand onto his shoulder. Like magic, he felt life return to him. "I don't know." A rare moment for him. Mardon was really feeling lost. 6 soldiers relied on him. Not near even the smallest group of troops he'd served. But there seemed to be much more pressure. "Sit down." The tone of her voice left no room to argue, even if Mardon had wanted to. He looked at Awful, still seated in the chair. It seemed better to turn around and sit on the desk instead. Grace stood with her arms crossed. In a way, she almost looked disappointed in him. He gave a soft chuckle. "What?" She shifted her arms, placing her hands on her hips. "I'm listening, Mom," Mardon answered. She smirked. "Ass." A playful punch to his arm helped Mardon forget what lurked behind him. Grace sat next to him. "What did you say the message meant?" She looked at him, making it obvious that she refused to turn her head too far. "Nothing, right?" He nodded slowly. "No context, no message." "True." He didn't agree. Mardon hooked a thumb behind him. Grace stopped herself before she looked. A barely noticeable shudder passed through her body. He was weak. Her statement was true, but Mardon didn't want to agree. He didn't like the idea of speaking ill of the dead, especially someone he served with. You, on the other hand, aren't. The weight wasn't too much to bear. The only thing needed was to keep everyone occupied until the response came in. Mardon shook his head. It would have been much easier without this mess. Grace pushed her shoulder into his arm. Mardon looked down at her. The face that greeted him bore no doubt. There was still fear in there, but having Grace so fully sure of him was oddly reassuring. "You are strong," she insisted. The future was uncertain, the troop was scared, and part of that was his fault. Mardon had told them that the answer would come with the supplies. He shouldn't have sounded so certain. The look in her eyes was so welcome, though. Mardon gave her a half-smile. Grace patted him on the shoulder, then pushed herself off the desk. Her smile fell as she looked around and saw the body again. She sighed. "I've seen so many dead bodies, even lost a few friends. This one feels different." Mardon nodded solemnly. Want some help with that? With a heave, he lifted himself off the desk and joined her. Awful's body sat tauntingly in the chair. The bottle of scotch lay on the floor next to him. The gun lay in his lap. Mardon shook his head. Such a shame. I think I should handle this myself, Mardon answered. Grace gave him a quick, reassuring hug and then left. Mardon stared for a while longer. He didn't want to let his captain go without honor like this. Finally, he stepped forward and got to work. The body landed heavily on the floor in the hangar. Despite the effort to minimize the drop, Mardon was tired. The CO was heavy, especially his dead weight. Wrapped just in the unceremonious bedsheet, the body would be frozen in an hour or so. All things considered, Mardon still wished he could award the captain something better. He certainly didn't want the story of Awful's suicide to make it home. There had to be a better story for his end. Against his better judgment, Mardon dropped to the floor next to Awful's body. He shook his head. A little less than 2 weeks, and we would have heard back from command. Why couldn't you wait? The cold started to hurt. Mardon ignored it as best he could. You aren't the first, you know. Not even the first I served under. The body remained unresponsive. Command is tough. Being the leader these kids need, a lot of pressure. He felt like he was addressing his own misgivings now. It was true, though. The decisions always felt heavier when others' lives depended on them. It was just a matter of making it through the next week and a half. Mardon gave up fighting the cold and climbed to his feet. The body would probably freeze faster than he thought. Once more, Mardon lifted Awful from the ground and carried him to the small room. This room had never been used, to Mardon's knowledge. It served as the morgue. All dead personnel would be placed in here to be removed when supplies came in. No one had died in the time Mardon had served on this base. Big change from the swamp. Sir? A tinny voice interrupted. It sounded like Will, though Mardon wasn't paying enough attention. Don't call me that.
Sorry, Sarge, we have another problem.
The voice seemed calm despite the situation. Perhaps this wasn't as bad. Chris sat in his armor, holding his rifle up right next to him. His helmet sat on the bench nearby. The look on his face almost physically hurt. He was rambling about something when Mardon stepped into the armory. I swear, I'm not lying. It was... When he saw Mardon, Chris stopped talking. Kevin followed his gaze. Well, he laughed sardonically, we may not be alone. The smirk was of pure annoyance. As if we needed another thing to worry about. The most telling part of this situation was Chris's blonde hair. It was wet. Sweat still ran down his face. Tell me. Well, I was out there, standing on my watch like usual. Nothing was happening, but then the wind kicked up and I heard something. I looked, and that's when I saw it. Chris rattled this off quickly. He had probably repeated that explanation a few times. Saw what? Mardon asked. Kevin scoffed. The look Mardon shot him cut off any response. I don't know, Chris said. Mardon rubbed his eyes with his thumb and forefinger, then the rest of his face with his palm. The groan was very telling. I saw it, he insisted. A nod. Mardon gestured for Chris to follow him. He led them to the small office in the back of the armory and flicked on the light. The small security office had apparently fallen out of use before Mardon arrived, but he knew about it. He probably knew more about the base than anyone who worked here. The security monitors still work and sprang to life with the light. There were 6 exterior cameras on this side of the base. The one that still worked was the one pointed directly at the watch station. A little bit of rewinding, and Mardon was watching as Chris stood watch. He was leaning against the wall, just listlessly scanning the tundra, much like everyone probably did. There was technically a road under that ice, even a heater to de-ice it, but it was put there when there was still hope that this base would be useful. Chris stood bored for a few minutes as they all watched. Suddenly the figure on the camera jumped up, pulling his rifle to the ready and aiming it down the road. There was a moment of silence. No doubt Chris was saying something, but the camera had no audio. There was a flash as the large rifle discharged, sending its deadly bolt off camera. Mardon gave Chris a stern look, who returned a sheepish downcast. For a moment the figure disappeared, walking off post in the direction he had fired. He returned, then more silence as he fumbled with the bay doors. Did you hit it? Mardon asked. Chris said nothing, but he could feel the shift in the air as he shook his head. His hand reached for the console but stopped, suddenly remembering his own experience the other day. But there were no shadows, no movement on this video feed since Chris left his post. "Alright, suit up, Kevin, we're going out." Mardon wasn't sure if he believed Chris. He didn't even believe in himself, but even a slight chance that they may have unwanted visitors meant he had to check it out. The ice crushed easily under the heavy boots of the trio. As though angry at the trespass, the wind howled over the hill. Mardon turned to look at the base, an oblong gray box a little less imposing from this angle. This was as far as he was comfortable going away from his little home.
It was standing up there.
Chris's voice came through the helmet. From this distance, he could have seen something. The watch post was visible, significantly distant, but not beyond reason. The rangefinder said it was 160 yards. A person would be recognizably human at this distance, but anything else would have been difficult to discern. They began looking over the area. The ice was cracked here, but their own footsteps could have done that.
"Sarge!"
Kevin called. Mardon glanced over. He was looking down at the ground. Mardon and Chris walked over. Their eyes saw what Kevin pointed out before he said anything.
"This is where the shot hit."
The perfectly bored hole was about an inch wide in diameter. Crouching, Mardon looked into it. There was no telling how far it went down, but the hole had already begun filling with ice.
"What about this?"
Kevin asked. Mardon looked again. Their boots cracked the surface of the ice, breaking up the frozen ground. In a very similar pattern, there was a crack in the tundra a few feet behind the hole, on the crest of the hill. Mardon stood and joined Kevin. There were no other marks on the ice beyond this one. "It could have fallen and retreated down the hill after Chris shot at it," Kevin offered. "Or it could have cracked from beneath after the shot hit." Mardon parried the thought. He still wasn't sure if anything was out here. He pressed a few buttons on his arm panel and the suit emitted a pulse around them. The HUD and the helmet immediately brought up results. There was nothing organic around them. The only imperfections in the tundra were the hole, this strange crack, and their own footprints. "If there was something out here, it would have left more of a mark." "Come on, Mardon, you are fucking lying to yourself," Kevin's voice echoed in Mardon's helmet. "Stand down, Sergeant."
"No, fuck that. You and I both know we've been abandoned out here. There's something coming for us, and the only thing Command did to help was warn us. We are royally fucked."
Kevin was angry enough that stomping didn't even seem to convey his ire. "We don't know anything right now," was the only response he could call up.
"Stop fucking deluding yourself," Kevin screamed. "Look around you. We have been left to die on a chunk of ice while the rest of our world goes on without us. Think rationally for a moment."
Mardon was doing his best to calm down.
"Why?"
Kevin stopped and stared, the blast shield hiding whatever was on his face.
"You said it yourself. This is just a chunk of ice."
Mardon gestured wide to demonstrate the world around them.
"There is nothing here. We aren't some military priority. So why would anyone try to take this base? Why would anyone invade?"
A silence descended on the hilltop. The wind even died around them. As the silence threatened to overwhelm them, Mardon sighed.
"We aren't going to find anything. Let's just go back in."
Kevin was the first to agree. He turned and stomped off towards the base. Chris waited until Mardon moved before following. Inside, the warmth was almost immediate. In their tension, they seemed to have forgotten the cold, but the difference was enough to shock their systems. "I'm telling you, we need to evacuate. We need to bail on this whole base," Kevin said. A sudden outburst caught Mardon off guard. He pulled his helmet off and set it down. "And I'm telling you, we can't. We just have a short week and a half, and then we will get a reply," Mardon answered. Beyond Kevin, Mardon saw that the rest of the crew had gathered outside the armory. They were watching expectantly. This wasn't good. The two of them comprised the top level of their chain of command. They couldn't be fighting like this. "And if they send bad news? Or no news? Are you just going to make up another excuse as to why everything is just fucking hunky-dory?" Mardon shifted his eyes back and forth between Kevin and the group behind him. Kevin saw the gesture and turned to see everyone. He turned back, his face red in anger. "Fuck them! I'm worried about me! I'm not going to be giving the Force my life anymore. They don't deserve it."
"Kevin!"
Mardon's deep voice carried a power he wasn't expecting. "Stand down!" Kevin blanched for a moment before recovering himself. "Fuck you!" Suddenly, there was an armored fist coming straight for Mardon's face. There was no time to think, just act. A simple step to the right, and Mardon grabbed the wild swing. He felt the pistons in his own suit whir to life as he crushed Kevin's armor under his arm. He reached out and slammed his palm into Kevin's chest, denting the armor, knocking Kevin to the ground. The look on his face was one of shocked realization at what he had done and what had happened. He looked back to the other troops. He scrambled to his feet. "Mark my words, Captain. We are all going to die out here." With that, Kevin staggered out of the armory. "Kev," Grace reached out for him. "Let him go," Mardon said softly. Grace looked back at him. Mardon could only stare at his hand, moving it within the armor, and staring dumbfounded. Had that fist hit him, he would have been dead. Kevin knew the power of these suits, but would he really have been okay killing Mardon? Day 12. The mess was quiet. Not empty, but no one was talking. Even Chris and Shelley were silent. Mardon had stopped the exterior watches against his better judgment. The crew just didn't want to go out there in case whatever Chris had seen was still there. Instead of watch, Mardon himself went out and walked the perimeter of the base daily. Sometimes he went alone. Sometimes Grace went with him. Nothing. The mysterious person or creature or whatever never returned. If Chris actually saw something, maybe it was scared off by the shot. That wasn't the big issue, though. The biggest problem was Kevin. Since their fight, he had vanished into the base. If there was anyone who knew the base even close to as well as Mardon did, it was Kevin. As such, there was no one who would be informed enough to go find him, and Mardon couldn't spare time to go looking, so he just had to worry. The troubling part wasn't what might happen to Kevin, though. Instead, the worrying thought was, what would Kevin do? It was easy to think of Kevin as a friend, after everything they had been through, but now Kevin was panicked, desperate. Couldn't blame him, but that made him unpredictable and dangerous. A person as skilled as Kevin, he could do major damage. But what would the point be? Just 2 more days now and they would have their answer. Mardon scanned the faces of his men, taking in their pain. Grace was doing well at hiding her fear now. The shock of the situation had worn to a dull edge, and she was coping better, even smiling some. But Mardon was adept enough to see the screaming behind her eyes. Well, it was about time to talk again. Mardon stood up from his place at the table and cleared his throat. "I want to say thank you, everyone." All eyes turned toward him. He gave his half smile. "I know it was a rough couple of weeks, but here we are now. We will know by this time, day after tomorrow. In the meantime," he had to clear his throat again, "you have all done well. All things considered, I'm proud of you for keeping it together." It seemed a hollow sentiment, considering some of them barely managed, but it was true. Mardon stooped, placing a hand on the table. "We don't know what message will come, if any. So I want you all to know, we will be abandoning this post if the news is bad. It will be unsustainable in a few months, and I will not risk any of your lives." There was a collective nod around the mess. After Awful left them, Mardon had been sure he would lose another the same way, but Grace was right. Maybe he was a good leader. "Today I want some of you to make sure the evac is prepared, make sure there are supplies for us, and that nothing is frozen," Mardon finished. He went to sit back down, but was stopped by Will's voice. "What about Kevin?" He looked at the corporal. There was a moment when he wasn't sure what Will meant by that question. "He's one of us. We can't leave him here." Mardon gave a chuckle at this. "Don't worry, Will. He will come back, or I will personally track him down and drag him onto the evac," he explained. "But how will he know?" "If it will make you feel comfortable, I will make an announcement. There are speakers all over the base. He is bound to hear the message." There was another collective nod. Mardon smiled again and sat down to his lukewarm coffee. "Attention!" Mardon cringed at his own voice as it echoed through the halls. "Attention! Kevin!" The announcement system went through the entire base, even outside. There was no way he wouldn't hear it. "We have decided that, if we receive bad news or no news, we will be evacuating. Meet at the mess morning after tomorrow. We will have the news by then. We don't want to leave you behind." There. This way he would be able to meet with the crew and they could all leave. But he wouldn't be forced to join them before then. Or he could choose to stay behind if he wanted. Mardon sighed. It was almost time for his daily walk outside. Part of him wanted to stay, just forget about it until the message came, but no. He had to at least put up the pretense that everything was okay. He pushed away from the desk and nodded to Megan as he left the radio room. Just one more day and a wake-up, he reminded himself, so close. The same as every day. Nothing. The walk felt good, though, if for no other reason than it got him away from everyone else and made him feel like he was doing something. It was a lie, but at least Mardon felt better that way. He was alone today as he trudged over the tundra, his eyes constantly moving. It was painful to think about where they were now. Just a few short days ago, everyone was content, if a little bored, but that was the nature of life, really. Complacency and contentment rarely last. Mardon looked up as he passed under one of the exterior cameras. Might not take much to upset it, but life was at least very resilient. Even counting offals checking out the way he did. Mardon felt the worst part of this was Kevin. He was, well, the closest friend he had had since he was a child. To think that their relationship was so flimsy as to fall apart at this. Maybe Kevin was right, though. Maybe Mardon was being delusional. After all, he did know how expendable they were. He abandoned that train of thought. Just a day and a half, 2 at most. "Captain!" Will's voice cut through his thoughts. He sighed. This wasn't going to be good.
Don't call me that.
"Sorry, Sarge. There's something..." Mardon cut him off.
Hang on, I'll be right there.
With a groan, he shouldered his rifle and started walking back.
Oh, this is going to take a minute. What happened?
There was no response.
Will?
He gave it a moment. Still nothing. He cursed under his breath and picked up the pace. These suits were not built for running, but he pushed it as hard as he could. The door hissed as he entered the armory. The lights were off. A click and the low light filter activated. Mardon listened intently to the world around him. In the darkness he could hear the distant hum of the heater. That was the only sound. He stepped into the room. Usually the motion sensor would have turned the lights on by now. Mardon went to the door and left the armory. The cavernous main entrance was empty, silent and dark. Every instinct he had was telling him to run. No. The others were still there somewhere. The pulse practically yelled as it entered the room. It couldn't go beyond the door, but that was all it needed. There was someone else in here. "Kev," was all he managed before his armor was struck. The power drained from the suit, and he was falling back into a dark void in his mind. Day unknown. "They abandoned us?" Kevin's voice echoed across time. Calm. They needed to think. All of the eyes, civilian and military alike, were fixed on Mardon. He shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. "It doesn't matter, Sergeant. We do what we always do," he insisted. Kevin breathed deeply and nodded. "Everyone!" Mardon called out. The attention was almost painful. "Fall back to the bunker. Move quickly but carefully." As if to emphasize the importance of haste, a roar rose up above the trees. "They're already here," Kevin said distantly, his eyes restlessly searching the tree line. "You gonna make it?" Mardon asked, grabbing his shoulder. "Yeah." He was back, but still restless. "You go on ahead, I'll catch up." "You sure?" "Yeah. Go. Keep us alive, Captain." Kevin smiled at him. "Don't call me that." Mardon laughed as he turned to the crowd. The motors engaged, pushing the door closed. The crowd had scattered throughout the main bunker. Mardon looked around at the scared people in the dimming light. They needed him. They were relying on him. He turned just as the door sealed. The sounds from the forest had arrived. The first impact caught him by surprise. The others screamed. "Make sure to go as soon as you can," he shouted. "Find any way to get out. Escape. Live." The air became thick, slow, as Mardon turned to face the blast door. "But they didn't escape, did they?" Kevin's voice whispered in his mind. "They died. Slaughtered. As you watched." Mardon felt the tear fall from his eye as the pain tore through his heart. "I tried my best," he answered. "I tried. It wasn't you. It was them. The chain of command. I was responsible for them." "Only because you had to be." Mardon had his rifle to his shoulder, aimed at the blast door as he watched the massive talon tear through the metal in slow motion. "I was supposed to die with them." He felt the prolonged recoil as the rifle fired. He didn't even manage that. What did they do? What did... medals. Patches. And a new command. Mardon laughed sardonically. "And now? We need you." A different voice cut in. He felt Grace's hand touch his face gently. The impact was far less pleasant than it should have been. Mardon recoiled from the slab and looked around. The bunker was gone, replaced with the radio room. The danger was still there, but different. Kevin stared at him. A sick and somehow sad smile splayed across his lips. Mardon couldn't move. Good morning. How'd you sleep? Mardon stretched his neck. He still wore the armor, but the helmet was gone now. Bad dreams. He looked himself over. There was a bit of blackening on the breastplate of the armor, but no visible damage. EMP? Kevin laughed. Yeah, best way to drop an armored soldier is to break their toys. Mardon nodded, then gestured at Kevin's own armor seated next to the console. The arm was crushed to uselessness. Sorry, by the way, he said. Kevin laughed again. So tell me, what did you dream about? Kevin glanced at the console. The icon blinked silently. The look in his eyes suggested that he had an idea of the dream. The swamp. Mardon nodded. How long had he been out? Not that it mattered much at this point. He doubted Kevin would have delayed telling him if the message had come, although, in this state, maybe he would have. He shifted his mind to trying to figure a way out. First time we were betrayed. Yeah, good times. Kevin's laugh slipped into a hiss. For you, maybe. With no power, the suit was useless. He could still lift it, but there was no way he'd be any use trapped inside. Oh yeah, that's right. You weren't naturally born, were you? Mardon shook his head. Nope. Foreigner. Maybe if he pushed himself up, he could fall on Kevin. No, that's stupid. Best bet would be to get a leg to kick out. You never had it easy, huh? This is probably a cakewalk for you. He nodded. Damn this armor. I killed them. The comment shook any plan out of Martin's mind. His eyes snapped to Kevin's instantly. What? Dumbfounded. It was the only response he could come up with. Oh yeah, in fact, he drifted off and stepped out of the room for a moment. Mardon tried to brace himself for whatever Kevin brought back, but he failed. When Kevin held Will's head up as a trophy, Martin's heart fell out. Suddenly all of his strength was gone. Will was the last one. He was lucky. He didn't have to see me kill anyone else. I just let him come over here to call you, then ended his pain for him. Martin's brow knit together as he looked from Will's lifeless eyes to Kevin's psychotic. Megan watched me kill Chris and Shelley. I didn't want them to die alone. Not a love as pure as theirs. Kevin giggled. Why? Kevin ignored the question, but what he said could have been an answer. The captain was the only one I enjoyed killing. He abandoned us just like the rest of them. This revitalized Mardon a little. So now, just like before, it's just you and me, the only survivors of a failed mission. With great effort, Mardon began to rise. His grunts of effort and strain thudded into the small room. Don't worry. The laugh again. That damned laugh. I wasn't going to leave us to their whims again. We will die too. Slowly, painfully, Mardon raised the useless hand towards Kevin. Sweat was streaming down Mardon's face, but the fury drove him on. You forgot one thing. Kevin frowned. You're pathetic. That suit has no power. You can't hurt me in it. Kevin screamed. No, but I can. There was a loud clang as a pole struck Kevin in the head, dropping him. Grace jumped over his fallen form and began pulling the emergency release on the suit. Mardon sighed deeply as the individual parts loosened up on him and fell away, clanging uselessly to the deck. Kevin clambered to his feet, sparing one last look before running away. I forgot how heavy those are, with no power in them. Shit, I thought you were going to have an aneurysm. How'd you even stand up? Grace asked, helping him into a chair again. Preempting any answer, a sudden sharp beeping startled them. They stared at each other for a moment, then looked at the monitor. The icon was flying across the screen, leaving strings of code behind it. The printer kicked on. The room suddenly filled with noise as the message arrived. Martin's brow knit together again. He gasped a scoff. Grace swore loudly. Day 14. This is... Martin stared down at the paper in his hand, his other a trembling fist. Monsters. Grace finished for him. He slowly crushed the paper into a ball, as tight as he could manage. Were within his power, he would have burned it with his rage. What do we do now? Bad news, Martin replied simply. We go. He wasn't sure how he felt. Well, that wasn't true. He knew he was mad. But at who? At what? The fact that his whole team now lay dead because of a stupid training scenario ranked high up on the list, though. As they left, Mardon reached over and turned off the radio equipment. There was some small satisfaction in that. He hated to believe it, but Mardon knew they didn't matter to Command. They were, and would always be, expendable. Kevin had used his armor, even with the broken arm. There was no way he could have done this with his own strength. Mardon cursed for not destroying Kevin's armor before leaving the radio room, even more so now that he saw what Kevin was willing to do. With Grace's help, Mardon pulled the metal pipes from Chris and Shelley, letting them fall to the floor. There was a creeping sense of horror as his eyes turned to the environment chamber across from them. The hangar lay beyond. There was no way anyone could have survived more than a few minutes without a suit out there. And yet, Grace was a boon that Mardon could not have lived without, though he found himself wondering, as she helped pull the bodies into the chamber, why Kevin would think he had killed her. He did specifically say he killed them all. No, he just said them.
Why are you alive? Mardon asked.
Grace dropped Chris's body and straightened. Well, screw you too. She laughed. Only a soldier could manage levity at a time like this.
No, that's not what I mean.
She nodded, then turned to put on the light suit. He never even came looking for me. At least I don't think he did. I hate scuba diving. Mardon turned back from his own suit, a questioning brow raised. She just finished zipping up. The suit did resemble a wetsuit. I saw him stalking Will. Best word I could think of for it. That look in his eye, it was just pure insanity.
We've been through a lot. This was just the final straw.
Finally dressed, the two opened the outer door and dragged the bodies out into the cold. Just as he thought, Megan sat curled up, frozen to the bulkhead. She wouldn't have had long to suffer, but it could not have been comfortable. The fear in her eyes struck Mardon hard. He and Grace lay the bodies of Chris and Shelley next to her.
Get the heat going. I'll bring up the evac,
Mardon said. The sirens wailed outward onto the tundra, the amber lights glinting off the ice and snow. Mardon would have traded anything for his armor in that moment. Anything to make him feel even a little safer. There was no way that Kevin wouldn't have heard. That, wherever he was, he wouldn't come running. If nothing else, the fear of being abandoned again would drive him toward them. The evac ship would be safe once they get the hangar doors open. Grace pulled the cockpit door open and went in. Mardon would wait as she did the final checks. His rifle, even. Anything. He cast his eyes about the hangar for anything. Toward the back were the excess base and evac ship parts. One rotor blade was taller than he was, but there was plenty of replacement pipes. He grabbed one that felt comfortable enough to swing and returned to watching the door. The creeping cold was eating its way into his suit. The silence went on far too long. The screaming in his joints became almost audible as he shifted his feet. Finally, the alarm started up again. The dull rumble joined as the hangar doors began to move apart. "Get your ass in here, Sarge!" Mardon had no recourse but to obey. He cast his pipe aside and climbed into the ship, closing the compartment behind him. He sat in the co-pilot chair next to Grace and pulled off his helmet. The warmth in the ship was almost unbelievable compared to the hangar outside. The shivers that ran through his body were uncontrollable.
Bit cold today,
Mardon managed. Grace laughed. She was busy doing whatever was involved in pre-flight. Checking the mirrors and tire pressure. Whatever. Mardon had never learned, nor wanted to learn, how to fly one of these. "Couple more minutes and we're out," Grace said distractedly.
Roger.
The urge to fall asleep was almost too strong to ignore. The feeling was returning to his extremities, and the pain that caused was all that kept him awake. "I hate night flying," Grace chimed up again.
"It's always night here."
His turn to laugh. "I swear when we hit the angle just right, we get that sunshine." She seemed done with her switch flipping and was more focused on him.
"I see what you're doing. You're trying to keep me awake."
He scoffed. "Well, I can't have you going to sleep while I'm driving. Need the company." She gave him the warmest smile. "So where are you going to go?" she asked.
"Home,"
he replied. "You know, as long as I've known you, I've never asked where you're from," she prompted.
"No, you didn't."
With a laugh, she punched him. That laugh may as well have been a furnace for him.
"You love me,"
he said simply. "Still doesn't change the fact that you're an ass." One last check, then she engaged the tires. The ship was moving. "So, where are you from?" The ship pushed out of the hangar, picking up speed as it went. Once he saw the sky, he lifted his arm up, pointing at a distant star.
"There."
For a moment she was quiet as she let that sink in. Then, sympathy strong in her eyes, she looked over at him. Earth? I'm so sorry. He reached out a hand, listening to the cacophony of protest from his joints, and lightly placed it on her cheek. You did say I was strong. A sudden jarring rocked the controls out of Grace's hand. An explosion in the rear. Mardon looked back and lifted himself out of the seat. As he put his helmet back on and pulled open the cabin door, he realized what Kevin had said. Another explosion and Mardon was slammed into the overhead. The world swam and went dark. The sound of crackling fire. The howl of wind. The cold was back, biting into him. Mardon attempted to focus his eyes. Beyond the orange of the flame and blue of the ice, it was nearly impossible, but there you are. Fear. His old acquaintance gripped at him again. He slowly pushed himself off the deck and looked. Not wanting to, but looking anyway. Her face was serene, not like Megan's had been. Grace didn't even have time to be scared. The cold had taken her so quickly. Mardon clenched at his heart. His whole body shook as the dark, morose feelings tried to take him, the burning in his eyes, to force him to blink. He placed a hand on her cheek again. It was as though, even through his suit, her skin pulled the little residual heat from his fingers. I killed them. We will both die too. These words cracked and froze in Mardon's mind. It took every ounce of strength he had to push himself away from Grace. Yet he turned. Her body would rest here until this planet melted. He left the cockpit, seeing the devastation Kevin's bombs had wrought. Most of the evac ship was gone now. That didn't matter anymore. As he stepped out into the freezing tundra, he had only one thought in mind. One foot shifted against the ice under his boots. The resulting crunch was satisfying, but did little to lift Mardon's mood. The mournful wind played across the tundra, and Mardon walked. Then Mardon fell. He lay still for far too long. The ice crunched next to his head. Something stood there. He didn't have the energy to fight. He didn't have the energy to move. And when the large hand closed around him, he didn't have the energy to resist. That would explain why Chris was sure he'd seen something. The massive cloaked figure lifted Mardon from the ice and pointed into the distance. The oblong gray block lay there. The first orange flower gave Mardon enough energy to smile. He watched as the rest of the base was consumed by a ball of fire. As the last fleeting vestiges of life left him, he heard one word. Guilty.
And there you have it. Our soldier Mardon, falling in a battle he should not have fought. Guilty for something he should not have been guilty for. Punished for something he didn't deserve. But anyway, that's going to be it for the Spooktober season. Thank you all so much for your love and support this year. Hopefully you've had a great, frightening experience with your year. And, well, see you next year.